Well, after part one got, shall we say, very, very, very spirited, and by spirited I mean I got absolutely ragingly, inducingly angry to the point I nearly popped a blood vessel, let's talk about the beginning, the rise, and what really became the formation of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship lineage. Let's talk about the good times before we get to Tyrus being the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Thanks, William Patrick Corgan, you fucking moron. I'm John Retton with my real honest thoughts on the rise and fall of the NWA World Heavyweight Championship Part 2. May do Part 3, not sure. But this is going to be talking about a bit of the history. If I try to do an entire timeline, one, I'm not a wrestling historian. This is just stuff from research, wrestling podcasts, people that studied up on this, and just me observing things, like reading up on this stuff. Like, it doesn't take much to research this, and also talking about some of the incredible reigns, back when the NWA World Heavyweight Championship meant something. You can check out part one if you want, if you really want to hear me just get absolutely raging, just god damn it, I really, really had a headache after that, but it was necessary. Because I can guarantee you this, while I root for people to succeed in the current incarnation of the NWA, I will not be watching it again. If they're going to make Tyrus the World Heavyweight Champion, I don't care. I'm putting politics aside. Tyrus has no business being the world champion or a champion of any major wrestling promotion. There's a reason why he wasn't in WWE, because he was a joke and he was approaching 40 by the time they released him. Actually, now that I think about it, I think that he was just over 40. Nevertheless, age is just a number, which actually explains a lot of the demographic that appreciates Tyrus's views, if you know what I mean. Nevertheless, and you go back to George Hackenschmidt, Frank Gotch, Ed Strangler Lewis, all these people that were world champion, and various people that held the championship, had claims to it. Jim Londos was a big star. Whipper Billy Watson. So many great talents throughout the years. Before the National Wrestling Alliance was formed, there was a National Wrestling Association, and there were other world champions that were around. And, they would always do disputed finishes to lead to big returns. Jim Londos was very, very over, especially with the Greek audience. There's just gifts of film from those packed stadiums. And my goodness, I wish that somehow film from that could be, full film of his matches could be translated to digital, put on YouTube, put in a DVD, Blu-ray, whatever. I wish we could see some of that stuff instead of just seeing little clips, because it just looks so cool to see everybody in all suits enjoying this and just enjoying wrestling, the sport of kings, and how professional wrestling really was appreciated. And granted, back in the pioneer days, it obviously was seen as more of a shoot, and clearly the people that were super talented, that were legit shooters, hookers, well, Luthez was a hooker, but a hooker of a different kind. If you know that line, you know that line. But there were various people that were legit athletes, and there were people that could be the sports entertainment type. And I'm going to talk about some of those people. What do you mean, those people? God damn it, Hulk Hogan, get out of my head. The NWA governing body, founded in Waterloo, Iowa, or the environs of, on July 14th, 1948. And Orville Brown was the first ever NWA champion. But apparently a car accident ended his reign, and Luthez was made the champion. And Luthez is regarded as one of, if not the greatest world heavyweight champions of all time. I mean, seriously, like looking at another page of notes here, 3,749 days. 3,749 days. Some people haven't even had jobs that long. It's just goddamn incredible. Really, really incredible. And there were the dispute reigns and stuff like that to all talk about. But Luthez was made the champion, just based solely on the respect that he had, the fact that he drew in St. Louis, he drew all over. And even though back then, in the late 40s and even into the early 50s, as television rose up, started to form and everything, and stations were looking for programming, wrestling meant a lot. Luthez would wrestle all over. Him and Vern Gagne had some incredible matches, but before that... The NWA governing body, basically, it was, a governing body, an agreement among various wrestling promoters, people that had their own little, areas that they promoted, that they would have it was a 9-panel vote, and you had to have a majority thing. You had to have at least 5-4. It helped if you had like 6-3, 7-2, 8-1, 9-0. We really want this guy to be champion. If you had the vote of confidence, then they would book you. A certain percentage of whatever gate it was, say it's $100,000, and say the champion pocketed 20 grand, roughly, right around that. Or maybe not even 20 grand, let's just say 10 grand. Well, like, I think it's 3-4% would go back to the NWA offices to cover travel expenses and all that. And the other people would walk away with money in their pocket. I believe Gary Hart was quoted on the Heroes of World Class documentary that was done right before Vince bought the library, or Kevin Von Erich sold the library to him, that Ric Flair, like during one weekend or whatever, like walked out with over 30 grand in his pocket after the NWA got their share. And that was in 82, 83. It's a big goddamn deal. I think it was 82, actually, now that I think about it. And unfortunately, as you know, there was Lou Thesz, there were others. I mean, you take a look through the history or whatever, because I got the reigns written down here. That after Lou Thesz had won it in late November of 1949, you had Leo Nomalini. It was a disputed finish and everything. It was in San Francisco, and that was one of those disputed ones where he had a championship. That was in 55. Lou Thesz came back and won it from him like a number of months later. Then you had Whipper Billy Watson, who was really appreciated as just a pure technical wrestler, very over in Canada, and won the championship in Canada, Toronto specifically, via countout. And you could lose a championship via countout or disqualification in those days. And then from there, you know, we would have other stuff going on. There would also be things like where Lou Thesz would be feuding with Verne Gagne. They would have, I think it was like, they had 2 draws, and then a third one, it was disqualified. But for some reason, the title stayed with Lou. They did this dispute thing. This is after Verne Gagne was made the U.S. champion after traveling around for a bit, and he would be the U.S. champion, booked out like the NWA World Heavyweight Champion. We get a percentage of the gate, made money, and that money, you know, and finding Wally Carbo and others to help him, he helped form the American Wrestling Association. Since he couldn't get a fair shot against Lou Thesz, it was like, okay, I'm going to face this guy, or I'm going to face this, I'm going to win the world championship here. If Lou Thesz doesn't show up, I'm the champion. I face this guy, I become the first champion. And since he was so revered in the Minnesota area for being a legit shooter, great professional wrestler, great amateur wrestler, well-respected war veteran, and just well-respected in general as far as being an Olympian, Verne Gagne was able to split away. And geographically, the American Wrestling Association, as it formed, helped because the NWA was going through some antitrust issues because of all the areas they were booking out the champion to. And there are other things as far as like what led to that. But okay, look at all this area that we cover. We'll look at the American Wrestling Association. They have Minnesota. They have all these areas. The Dakotas. They're going all the way out to the West Coast eventually. And that actually helped. The NWA did kind of get into disarray. Partly due, and this is, let's get into that here, because there were the disputed finishes, and you would you would have a guy win a championship, but since even though there was television, there were newspapers, but news traveled pretty slow in those days. So Whipper Billy Watson wins it in Toronto in 56, like in March of 56, and then loses it back to Lou Thesz a number of days later, or a number of months later, rather, in November. And that was in St. Louis, because Billy Watson was very revered there, too. And then Eduardo Carpentier, who was huge in Montreal. Huge. And I've only seen clips of the guy, obviously, because this is when television was forming. And I think even television coverage in Toronto, in Canada in general, wasn't as widespread. It took a while up there, just because of geography and setup and everything. But he was also over in Chicago, and Chicago was a big hotbed for professional wrestling in the 50s. They would sometimes run like, 4 or 5 live events a week in television studios and even in bigger arenas because they were so wrestling crazy because Chicago has a rich history of professional wrestling. I mean, going back even before the 50s. And Eduardo Carpentier won it, and it was another disputed finish and everything. But the promoter, I forget the guy's name. God damn it, I'm going to kick myself for it. But Eduardo Carpentier only held it for a bit. Lou Thesz won it back in Montreal. Big goddamn deal. Big goddamn deal. But then Lou Thesz, he'd been wrestling since the 30s, mid-30s. He's looking to slow down. I mean, even with the travel, even with the money, even with all that stuff and everything, even with making tons of money. I mean, there were years he was making $100,000 in the late 40s into the 50s, or close to it, and he was making the equivalent of close to $1 million in today's money, which is a lot because you use the inflation calculator, put in $100,000 from like the late 40s, early 50s, and it's close. If it's not quite $1 million, it's damn close because that all that can change from year to year. But after beating Eduardo Carpentier, Lou Thesz decides, hey, wait a second, I protected this championship long enough to know this. Let's pick Dick Hutton. Now, Dick Hutton is a name longtime wrestling historians, longtime wrestling fans may know. Infamous name. He won it in Toronto about just under 4 months later. Now, he held it for about 400-something days. That seems like a big deal. Here's the issue. During that time, and that's 57, the American Wrestling Association gets formed. Other territories start to get formed, in large part because Dick Hutton was not a draw. He was legit as far as his ability, had no charisma, had no presence, didn't have the aura to draw you in. Now, Gorgeous George, not Randy Savage's later girlfriend, but the original Gorgeous George, was very over as far as pomp and circumstance and, the flamboyancy. There were other wrestlers that came along. Many names that people could mention if you studied up on wrestling in the comments. And you can see where showmanship really was a big part of it. And Lou Thesz was pretty much a straight up wrestler, but he had the ability to carry himself as a legit shooter, but also did have enough charisma, more than enough charisma to get himself by. Dick Hutton did not. And his run as champion bombed. It bombed horribly. And I think maybe in St. Louis he might have drawn. I don't think it was incredible, but it's like in St. Louis. I mean, you could, at that point with Sam Muchnick helping promote, you could almost get anybody over if you really tried. And given that St. Louis was so wrestling crazy, Dick Hutton's ability may have gotten that, but just it didn't work. It did not click. So American Wrestling Association. Other territories were forming. The Worldwide Wrestling Federation would eventually form in the early 60s. American Wrestling Association, as I said, Fritz von Erich would get down to Dallas during this time, during the late 50s, the early 60s. And it would be big time wrestling. He would do some stuff and everything, and he would eventually get to, he would work with Ed McLemore. Ed McLemore would pass away, heart issues, I believe, and he would become the promoter. So all this stuff, just due to Dick Hutton, would have widespread effects. Now, it wouldn't be the end of the NWA, or obviously we wouldn't be talking about the NWA here. By we, I mean me and you listening or watching me and saying, what is this bald 41-year-old idiot saying about wrestling? But the whole point is that the Dick Hutton reign did have some widespread effects as far as causing other promotions to form. And then they went with Pat O'Connor. And that was in early 59. Now, that was a big goddamn deal. 903 days. Pat O'Connor, big goddamn deal. He wasn't maybe as charismatic as others, but he absolutely had the draw and had the ability, and he was great. He was great to watch. There's that Buddy Rogers, Pat O'Connor 2 out of 3 falls match, I believe at Comiskey Park in Chicago. It's in Chicago, or thereabouts. And it was 61, 63. I'm trying to remember. Let's see. Let's refer to the notes here. Yeah, it was 61. I was trying to remember that because actually 63 is when the Worldwide Wrestling Federation formed. But it turns out that Pat O'Connor was a big goddamn deal, and he had a really long reign. He only had one reign, 903. 903 days. Gave stability. The NWA had a draw. He was over in a lot of places. And then, stuff about Verne Gagne I mentioned. Other territories would pop up during this time. You would get, other promotions popping up. You get other versions of big time wrestling, like in Boston. And what you would get is like examples, like, let's go back to the reigns here and let's talk about that. Buddy Rogers would end up winning it from Pat O'Connor in the aforementioned Chicago 2 out 3 Falls match. He would hold it for 573 days. They would do disputed stuff, like where Killer Kowalski would win it in 61, just a number of months later, but obviously they wouldn't recognize it. He would be the champion here, big time wrestling in Boston. And Boston was wrestling crazy. The Northeast in general was very wrestling crazy. Boston, a big city that appreciated their sports stars, and Killer Kowalski would end up training various people, Triple H, Frankie Kazarian, and others. And Killer Kowalski was very, very revered, and this led to big booming business for Boston. Maybe not forever, obviously, but it led to something. And then Bruno Sammartino, he won it in Toronto, but he refused it, I think. But he had a medical issue, something. I don't remember, an injury. I don't remember exactly what it was. But then Bobo Brazil won. He won at Newark a little bit later from Buddy, and that was, due to an injury. And then Buddy Rogers won it back by beating Bobo. And Bobo Brazil, in a class all by himself as far as being, very exponentially, like, helping the views grow of the African American audience. Buddy Rogers held it for another 86. So really his, 573 days is recognized as one continuous reign. And then he beat Kowalski, doing this whole thing, unifying these championships, as it were. And meanwhile, what's happening is other territories are getting ready to form. He would lose it. There would be the Los Angeles version for WWA. Not World Wrestling All-Stars, not that short run of pay-per-views and TV tapings that went absolutely nowhere. That was mainly based out of Australia and New Zealand and had one show in Las Vegas that didn't draw. I blame Jeff Jarrett. I blame others too. Freddie Blassie was a big star in LA. Yes, the man that called everybody pencil neck geeks and is remembered mostly as a wrestler, was actually wrestling in LA as a top guy into his mid-50s. They wouldn't license a wrestler after 55, so he had to leave that spot. He wrestled in Atlanta, I believe, when Ann Gunkel was on one side of the Atlanta wrestling war. That was between 72 and 74, I believe. 72, 74, 75. Somewhere around that. And it was a big deal. That's something else I need to dive into at some point. That was pretty fascinating. And, Freddie Blassie was a big deal, and even wrestled in WWF and also managed. By the time he was challenging for the championship, the big championship, when he was approaching 60, and could still do it. And I hope the footage of that exists out there. I actually have to go check the cock and see if any of that exists. But if anybody knows about any Fred Blassie championship matches that exist from the Worldwide Wrestling Federation days, please drop them on safe links in the comments, please, and I will check them out. Because Freddie Blassie, yeah, he's primarily remembered as a manager, and remember Ayatollah Blassie and everything, and just making fun of Andre the Giant, and hell of a talker. Him and John Tolos, yes, the guy that played the coach for Mr. Perfect in, for a brief period at leading up to and at SummerSlam 1991. Yeah, Mr. Perfect had one of the biggest stars in LA wrestling with him. And Tolos, I don't think wrestled after the 80s. I know that he was part of Herb Abrams' UWF. In fact, if I remember right, I actually think that that's probably why he went to SummerSlam 91, because the UWF did not work out all that well. Anyway, so Buddy Rogers would take this championship to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. They would do a disputed thing, another disputed finish. He would lose it to Lou Thez, who They did, and then Bruno Sammartino would beat Buddy Rogers, and that would kick off the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And Bruno Sammartino having the championship for 2,800 days or close to it. Lou Thesz took the title back in January of 1963, and that was in Toronto. And then he held it for just under 3 more years. Just under 3 more years. Big goddamn deal. He would lose it to Gene Knitsky. And Gene Knitsky was a big, big star in Canada. And had times where he was earning upwards of 70, 80 grand a year. And that was before he became the NWA champion. He was the NWA champion for just over 3 years. A continuous reign of 1,131 days. And that's hugely, hugely influential. And then Gene Knitsky proceeded to almost screw up the Starrcade 83 main event. Yeah, I'm still not happy about that. But what ended up happening was, all through this history, we're getting some classic matches, we're getting some great title reigns. And then the 10 pounds of gold, the big globe design was a little off into the future. But after Gene Knitsky won it, what would end up happening is he would lose it to Dory Funk Jr. in Tampa. And, because the Funks were big in Florida, they were big in Amarillo, obviously. And they were big in Japan. And Dory Funk Jr. would actually hold it for 4 and a quarter years. 1,563 days, according to the notes. 1,563 days. The only person that actually has the championship, that held the championship longer, even though all this stuff happening with Lou Thesz and the disputed finishes, his official reign recognized as 2,300 days. And Dory Funk Jr. wasn't that far behind. God, all they had to do was give it to him for about another, just over 2 more years. You could have done it, you cowards. No, kidding. Dory Funk Jr., though, wins the championship in 1969. Nice. And then we get Harley Race. Harley Race beating him in Kansas City. Harley Race hugely over. That was May 24th, 1973. And he only held it for 57 days, which is a shocking thing because you think Harley Race, big-time champion, holy shit, his first reign must have lasted long. No, it didn't. The big gold belt design actually was introduced the day that Jack Briscoe beat Harley Race. Handsome Harley Race. The 8-time World Heavyweight Champion, Harley Race, on July 23rd, 1973. The 10 pounds of gold with the globe, all that classic design. He was now the champion. And Jack Briscoe actually held it for 500 days. And then Giant Baba beat him for it because Baba had a great working relationship with the NWA. He would get various NWA talents. He paid them well. He was well respected. And he then dropped it after a week. And then Jack Briscoe had won it back, and he won it on that tour of Japan. So he held it basically for, they recognized Baba's reign, but he basically held it for 866 days. And Jack Briscoe said finally, after he lost it to Terry Funk, just a year after he won it back from Baba, in late December of 75, he said, "That's it, please, get it off me. I can't take it. I don't know where I'm at. I don't know what I'm doing. I love the money. I can't do it." Terry Funk won it, and Terry Funk only held it for, just over a year, almost 14 months. And Dory and Terry Funk are Dory Funk Jr. and Terry Funk are the only brothers to hold the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. And I believe the only brothers to hold a World Heavyweight Championship, unless you count on the Indies. I'm not saying I don't. I'm just saying as far as prestige, let's be honest, this is where it's at. And the big gold belt design actually showed up later. But for the time, the dome globe is where people were able to find, that were able to see. They were able to see prestige with the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. And after Terry Funk dropped it to Harley Race in Toronto, what would end up happening is Dusty Rhodes would win it like 2 years later, or 2.5 years later, actually. He would win in Tampa. He would only hold it for 5 days before dropping it to Harley Race. Harley Race held it for 926 days, lost it, and then won it back and held it for 6 days. Dropped it to Giant Baba. Held it for 302 more days, and then dropped it to Giant Baba again, and then won it back for 250 days. And then he dropped it to Tommy Rich. Tommy Rich held it for all of 4 days. And then Harley Race would win it back on May 1st, 1981 in Gainesville. And then it would just get to where things would get really, really muddy. We would get, Dusty Rhodes winning it in Atlanta. He'd hold it for 88 days. Ric Flair would beat him in St. Louis. And Ric Flair was seen as somebody that could have been a draw, but there were some people that still didn't quite trust him. They weren't sure if he could do stuff, and they gave him enough of a vote of confidence, but he was still struggling to prove that he could be the man, the myth, the legend. And he was just getting started here. He would hold it for 631 days. And then there was a change to the Midnight Rider, Dusty Rhodes in a mask, and Carlos Colon in Puerto Rico. The guy that helped facilitate the murder of Bruiser Brody. Fuck Carlos Colon. Fuck Jose Gonzalez. Fuck anybody who likes him. Harley Race would end up winning it back. They ignored those title changes and everything. Because the Midnight Rider had to unmask. You can't have a masked wrestler as NWA champion. And he would just say, I did it for you, baby. Everybody knew it was Dusty. The Midnight Rider thing, by the way, quick sidebar, was because Dusty had to leave the territory, had to leave Florida, but then he came back under a mask as the Midnight Rider, and everybody knew it was him, but you could only prove it's him by unmasking him, like Stagger Lee when JYD had the mask on. It was obviously JYD as a goddamn champion. Nevertheless, what ended up happening is Harley Race would win it back on June 10th, 1983, and then he would win it from Flair. And then they would do that whole Flair for the gold, except it was Flare instead of Flair, but nevertheless, what is. We would then go to Starrcade 1983, and even in a snowstorm, they would do a 500,000 or so gate, and they would do closed circuit television, 30,000 people, whatever it is, in various little theaters or arenas that the broadcast signal was sent to. So that was probably, I would say, a good 700,000 that they drew as far as money, or closing it probably 750 grand now that I think about it. And Flair would actually hold it. They would say that he would hold it forever. He actually dropped it back to Harley Race to boost attendance on New Zealand tour, and then Flair won it back in Singapore. And then that was recognized as his reign. He would hold it for only 44 days before dropping it to Kerry Von Erich. So technically, Flair held it for a number of months and then dropped it to Kerry Von Erich, who only held it for 18 days. They're saying, World Class says, oh, well, it was because they didn't want to give up dates on Kerry. It was also because Kerry was having a problem making his bookings. Who knows what the actual reason was? I mean, let's be honest. Kerry Von Erich as a world champion was a great moment, but would you have trusted Kerry Von Erich to draw a ton at that point, even with his superstar-looking qualities? Probably not. Probably not. And that's really sad because Kerry had all the ability in the goddamn world. And then, after winning in Texas Stadium, Kerry Von Erich drops it back on a Japanese tour, and it holds it for 793 days. Holds it for another 2 years. Oh, just over 2 years. And then Dusty Rhodes wins back at Greensboro for the Great American Bash 1986 tour. Holds it 14 days, and Ric Flair beats him again, I believe, either ending the Great American Bash tour or just after the Great American Bash tour in St. Louis, and then would hold it again for 412 days. During this time, the big gold belt would get introduced at NWA Championship Wrestling for Florida Battle of the Belts 2, and that was it. Now, there's more history to dive into. I'll do that in the second part, and this is where things pretty much are at a peak, and then they start to really go down. Probably just going to finish it up with part 3, but we will see. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, subscribe, Twitter handle in the description. I'm John Retlin. I'll see you soon.